Hello and welcome to another Key Smash Studios video on our third-person shooter tutorial series. Today we're going to be working with some animations and getting them to play with your character. This video is intended as part of a series, but it can be used as a standalone if you come across this separate from the rest of the tutorial. With that said, I'd just like to say, if you haven't already, please consider commenting, and subscribing on our videos. It does help us out a lot, and we'll get started. If you're following along in our series from the playlist, you'll notice that there's a few changes. Rather than having the player capsule here, which I've just disabled, I've added in a character from a website called Mixamo. It doesn't really matter where you get your character, you just need to get one that has some animations. I'm assuming everyone's getting them from their own way, and we just need to figure out the code to make that work with our character controller. That said, if you do need Mixamo, I will put a link in the description below. It is a free website run by Adobe, and you are more than welcome to grab stuff from there. If there's enough interest, I will make an entire video on the Mixamo import into Unity. On our player capsule, before this was just a standalone object, I have just dropped the T-pose of the player as a child of that player capsule. I have also disabled the mesh renderer, which takes away only the mesh renderer of the capsule, and it leaves the capsule collider and the character controller as well as our script as part of the object. Additionally, I've put a rifle idle and a rifle run, and these are just rifles that will be activated from our various animations. But for right now, I've set them as inactive. This is not strictly necessary, it's just kind of a nice little touch if you do not have the prop built in as part of the animation. Oftentimes in AAA games, the skeleton of the character will contain a connection for the gun, so the gun animates with the character. However, if you don't have this option, we need to sort of makeshift a way that makes it look semi-realistic. And we'll get to that at the end of the video. The first thing that we're going to do, though, is we're going to make sure this character, when we walk around, as is, I've just dropped him on. He's got nothing else besides his basic animation, which we'll get to in a second. He's got nothing on him. For all intents and purposes, this is essentially just a fancy capsule, and when we go into play, just like before, we'll be able to move around, swap sides, zoom in, all that jazz. So we have the exact same starting point where we were last video, just with a T-pose character instead. And what we need to do is get our animations to go from a state where we have them and we've imported them into our project. So I have all these animations here. If I expand them and I look at the run, or the idle, or the T-pose, we can see that we have this animations on the side here. I'll pull this all the way over so we get a little bit better view of this. This animation is stored in an FBX file, so how do we get that FBX file to play on our character controller when we're not moving and we're idle? So we're going to go hop into the code to make sure that happens. But before we do that, we need to set up our scene. So the first thing that you need, if you don't have one on your character already, you need an animation. You can just hit add component and then type in animation and it'll pull up this thing. The amount of animations you'll need will depend on the number of animations you have for your character. Like I said, this is just more of a proof of concept thing. Every person's character controller and animations are going to be different from project to project. So this is intended to get you started, but not be an exact replica for you to follow. So for today, we're going to talk about the rifle idle animation, a run animation, and then our T-pose. Our T-pose is our standard one. We hope to never see this within the game. With that said, if you don't have any of these here, you just see it animations like this. If you just click this little down arrow, you can change the size of the elements here. If you want to add another element, you just hit the number, then hit enter, and it'll add another element, and you can click and drag animations in to the specific list. So go ahead and drag any animations that you need and just drag them onto that list, and then we'll get to it in the code. We're going to go to our PlayerController Script. Now that we're in our PlayerController Script, we're going to add a few things that we need today. First things first, I just created a little section here called constants just to separate the constants out so we know exactly what our variables are for and where they're stored. So the first thing that we need today is a way to reference the character model that is now a child of the capsule where we attach this script. If we look in Unity itself, we see that our player capsule has a child of the character model, and that character model has these animations. Now, there is a way in C# to grab a child and a component of a child, and it's just kind of a little more complicated than we need to make this. So all we really need to do is create a game object where we can click and drag this character model in as part of this C# script. So all we need to do is to come here and create a serialized field, and then just like before, we take this private game object and we call this one a character model. So now we have this character model that has all these animations. We need a way to determine whether or not this character model is moving, because we need to create these animations, and we need these animations to run at very specific times, but we need to know when the character is moving. So we need to create a bool to know if we're actively moving or if we're idle, because the two animations that we're going to be doing today are a run and an idle animation. I'm going to create a new section here. This is just a place where I'm going to put the in-script booleans for animation. If you're using a lot of animations, you might have a lot of booleans. Today we're just going to be using one, but that doesn't stop the fact that we might add more in the future if we continue this project. So today I just need one animation, and that one's just going to be called, am I actively moving or am I not actively moving? So I'm going to make a private bool called active move. And this is just going to tell me, am I moving or am I not moving? So initially, when we instantiate this, we need to make sure that it's false, because at the start, if I can type, at the start of our game, our character is not moving, so that should be our default value. As far as where animations go, I find it easiest to put them in their own function. So I'm going to go ahead and create a function here called void animations. And in this function, I'm going to do any coding that I need to do to make those animations happen. And since I'm creating a function, I need to make sure that I'm calling it in the right place. I want my animations to be checking to make sure they're playing at any moment, so I'm going to call this an update. So anytime our screen refreshes, it checks to make sure we're following the correct logic for our animations. So how do we make sure that we know we're going to the right place when we're moving? Well, down here, we get our input axis of horizontal and vertical, and we store it in a vector 3. That's how our character moves. But we can't quite use this logic exactly if we're trying to figure out whether we're moving or we're idle, because there are times where our inputs are 0 and we're not moving, but we still have an input get axis. So we need to determine whether it's positive, negative, or 0 in order to determine what animation we need to play. So the best way I can think of to do that is to create an if statement above this and use that if statement to trigger this boolean right here called active move. So we're going to create an if statement here. And inside this if statement, we need to figure out whether or not the character is moving or if they're standing still. Now we can do this in what's called a nested if statement, just like how I'm putting an if statement within an if statement here. So if we're grounded, we're going to do another if statement to determine whether or not we're moving. We could do it that way, or we could do this in just a single if statement and use an operator called an OR. And we'll get to that in a second. So the first thing we want to check is if our input.getAxis. So if our input.getAxis matches the horizontal input axis, we need to determine whether it's positive, negative, or 1. Really, we don't really care whether we're moving backwards or forwards for right now. I'm only doing a forward run in an idle, so I'll just say if it's not equal to 0, because that should be the idle. If it's not equal to a 0, this needs to be a float because inputs are floats. If it's not equal to 0 for horizontal, or, and this is shift and then it's the key right above enter if you've never done an or if the input of the vertical axis, so we need to do the same thing. So if the input of the vertical axis, much in a similar way, does not equal 0, what's happening? So if it's not 0, we are actively moving, right? We're either moving backwards or forwards or left or right. Now, if you have multiple animations, you'll want to split this up. If you have a forward run animation, you'll need to say if input dot horizontal is greater than 1 or vertical is greater than 1. You'll need to test it out to find out the exact orientation of your character model. But for all intents and purposes, we're just testing this out to make sure that it works with any animation. So if we're moving, that means if our inputs to either the horizontal or vertical axis are greater than 0 or less than 0, we are actively moving. So I'm going to come here and say active move is equal to true. And if that's not happening, active move is equal to false. So now, anytime we're on the ground, it checks to make sure. It says, hey, what are your inputs to the left and the right, and what are your inputs up and down? If any of those are not equal to 0, in other words, if you're moving in any direction at all, and your vector is not stationary, we are actively moving. That is true. Otherwise, we're actively not moving. Now we have this Boolean that determines where and when we're moving and where and when we're not moving. So what do we do? What do we do with that piece of information? Well, if you'll remember earlier, we made this private game object, and we also made this function here called animations. So what we're going to do is go into that animations, and we're going to use that Boolean that we just made. So we say, if we are actively moving, we do some function here. And if we are not actively moving, if not active move, we do some function here. Now, you can use an else here. It is true, you can use an else here. I would strongly recommend using only if statements in case you create more animations. So let's say you have a falling animation or a backwards running animation. You'll need to follow the same type of thing. You don't want to do a bunch of like if else's and if else's. You either need to do a bunch of ifs followed by else ifs, or just a bunch of if statements, and then if there's no animation, if animation is null, you put a default animation. But I strongly recommend following this thing. You can either do an if or an else if here like this if you're using multiple animations. But for today we're just using 2, so I'm just going to have it simple like this. So if we are actively moving, we need our character model to do something. Well, what we need to do is we need to get that component that we made earlier. So we're going to get that component that is an animation. And from there, we are going to play a clip. What clip? And that clip we just input there as a name. So we needed to figure out what the name is of that clip. Well, if we come to our clip here, we'll see that I have rifle idle and the run animation. So if we are moving, I would like to play run. And if we're not moving, well, I'd probably like to play the rifle idle. So right now we have a fairly simple animation that just says if we're running, if we're moving, we want to play the run animation, and if we're not moving, we would like to play the idle animation. So let's go ahead and test that out and see if that works. We should see right away that I never clicked and dragged the character model onto the character controller. So come to our player capsule here, and we're going to click and drag the character model that we have, where our animations are stored, onto the player controller script. So now that we've done that and we hit play, we see that when we're not moving, we have this idle animation. We can still turn around, and then when I start to move, we switch to a different animation. So this is a run, and it looks like it's holding a rifle, which is why I ended up adding those components from before. So if you'll notice, my hands move between the two different animations. One has the rifle off to the side. If I swap to the scene view here, you'll notice that my hands are off to the side. But if I come back to the game, you'll notice that when I start moving forward, those hands sort of jut forward like you're holding the rifle and you're aiming down sight as you move. Normally, you would attach a skeleton to the animation, but we don't always have a AAA budget to do stuff like this, so what's our way around having a gun that looks like it's facing two different directions without having to do a ton of code to move it based on the character's movement and the hand movement of the skeleton? So what can we do? Well, a really easy way to get around that is to have two different ones. So I've gone ahead and placed these a little bit. I'll turn them both on while we're in play here. And we'll see if I come into the scene that I actually have two separate guns. Now these aren't perfectly placed, they're not moving with the animation. If you'd like to do that, you'd have to go down into the skeleton architecture and attach it to the exact hand that matches up. But for right now, I think this will do as a sort of placeholder. So I have two different guns here, one for the run animation and one for the idle animation. You can see if I disable the run one and we go into the game, it looks like we can see just a little bit of the gun in the idle animation there. It rotates with us, it moves with us, but as soon as we start running, we notice that the gun is not really in the right place. However, if I go over here and I disable the idle rifle and enable the rifle run, when I start moving, it looks like we're actually moving with a rifle in our hands. Now, this is sort of a cheap trick to get around not having quite the right animations. So we need to code these in. So let's go back to our script, and just like before, we had the serialized field where we called in the information about the character model. We need to do the same thing for the game objects of our rifle run and our rifle idle. So we're going to create a private game object called rifle run, and we're going to create a second one, serialized field, of course, with a private game object called rifle idle. So we have in our animation two places where we know where they need to be active and where they don't need to be active. So while we're running, we only want the rifle run to be active, and while we're idle, we only want the rifle idle to be active. So while we're moving, we want our rifle run .game object to be .set active, and then this takes in a bool of true or false. Is it active, true, or is it not active, false? So our run rifle we want to be true, and at the same time while we're running, we want our idle rifle to be false. And conversely, in the opposite case, when we're not moving, we want the exact opposite to happen. We want our run rifle to be false, and we want our idle rifle to be true. So now when we come to this game, we need to, of course, this time remember to click and drag our game objects in. So rifle run comes to here, rifle idle comes to here. So now when we hit play, we can see that naturally when we have our idle animation, we have our idle rifle out. And then when we start moving, it swaps to the running rifle. And vice versa, when we switch back to the idle animation and back and forth, it'll just seamlessly switch. And we, the viewer, are not really all the wiser that it's two different rifles. So like I said, this is really meant to be a starting point for you. It's just a quick little tutorial on how to input the code to make your animations work. Obviously, everyone's character controller is going to be a little bit different depending on the project they're working on. As always, if you have any questions with that, please feel free to comment down below or hop into our Discord. We have a whole channel in there for questions and support. If you have any questions, please let us know in there. We're always happy to help. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. It really does help us out with the video as we march towards 1,000 subscribers. And hopefully we'll see you next week.